June 22, 1993. Dr. Charles Epstein, a respected geneticist, arrives home in California and finds an unexpected package waiting in his mailbox. The package lacks a return address and offers no clue about its sender. Inside his home, Epstein briefly mentions the mysterious delivery to his wife and daughter, sharing a moment of lighthearted curiosity. He takes the package into his private study, unaware of its true danger. Moments later, an explosion disrupts the quiet of the household, leaving Epstein severely injured. Only 2 days afterward, on June 24, Professor David Gelernter of Yale University receives a similar package at his office. As Gelernter opens the parcel, another explosion ensues, severely injuring him. These back-to-back incidents quickly reignite nationwide alarm, confirming fears that after a long period of silence, the notorious criminal known as the Unabomber has resumed his violent campaign. The man behind these attacks, Ted Kaczynski, was once recognized as a brilliant mathematician, a former professor, and a Harvard graduate. His life path took a disturbing turn after a series of controversial psychological experiments during his youth, profoundly affecting his mental state and worldviews. Driven by a deep resentment towards technology and modern society, Kaczynski spent nearly 2 decades orchestrating a series of attacks designed to instill fear and communicate his anti-technology ideology. This is the story of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, a gifted intellect whose dangerous crusade challenged law enforcement and captured national attention, leading to one of the most intense manhunts in American history. Today's story is a unique one. It's about the largest manhunt the FBI ever carried out for a single individual. In fact, it was the 7th largest case in the FBI's entire history, costing over $80 million, making it one of the biggest criminal investigations in history. So, let's dive into the story. The main character is a man named Ted Kaczynski, an American of Polish descent. He's considered one of the most dangerous criminals in U.S. history, known as the Bomber or the Unabomber. He was called that because his early targets were universities and airplanes. Before we start with Ted's crimes, let's go back to when he was a child to understand what led him to become the Bomber. Ted was born in 1942 into a regular family in the suburbs of Chicago. His family was of Polish origin, which is obvious from their last name, Kaczynski. His parents were educated and raised him with a strong focus on academics and science. And indeed, Ted turned out to be a genius. It was clear from an early age that he was exceptionally smart and far ahead of his peers. His parents pushed him even harder to excel, wanting him to stay ahead. Ted skipped 2 grades in school and ended up studying with kids 2 years older than him. Still, he remained the top student and the smartest among them. But that's when problems began. Ted started feeling lonely. He couldn't relate to his environment or the people around him. His classmates were older and not on his intellectual level, so they distanced themselves from him. Over time, his sense of isolation grew. Fortunately, he had a younger brother named David, and Ted built a strong bond with him. David became his closest friend because, truthfully, Ted had no other friends. The 2 brothers grew up inseparable until 1958, when Ted finished school and started college at Harvard University, no less, at just 16 years old. He was on a full scholarship, which shows just how brilliant he was. But his loneliness intensified after leaving his family and brother. The gap between him and his university peers grew wider. He would sometimes write letters to his mother blaming her for pushing him so hard that he missed out on a normal social life. Although he was intellectually gifted, emotionally and socially, he had been cut off from his environment because of the pressure to excel. During his time at Harvard, several experiences shaped the dark thoughts that would later define him. We won't get into those details yet. We'll save them for the end of the story, as they reveal how Ted began transforming into the Bomber. So, keep his Harvard years in mind. Despite everything, nothing diminished his intelligence. He graduated with honors, and in 1968, 5 years later, he earned a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. His doctoral thesis was so advanced that only 4 or 5 mathematicians in the world could understand it. It won several prestigious awards and was published. Ted then became a mathematics professor at UC Berkeley, but he only taught for 2 years before deciding to quit. And he didn't just quit his job. He quit modern life altogether. He'd only accepted the job to earn enough money to leave everything behind. He wanted to isolate himself from society and live alone, away from modern life. Ted had a strange philosophy about life. He was against technology and the rapid advancement that was beginning to dominate people's lives. We're talking about the 1970s, when TVs and computers were just becoming widespread, and people were starting to rely on them heavily. From Ted's perspective, technology was supposed to give humans more freedom, but in reality, it was taking their freedom away. His philosophy was that technology, created to liberate people, had turned against them and was now controlling them. We'll explore more of Ted's ideas later in the story. Ted decided to isolate himself completely. He bought a piece of land in the woods of Montana and built a small cabin there. His brother David helped him build it and actually supported the decision, believing Ted needed peace due to his troubled thoughts. So starting in 1971, Ted lived in that cabin without electricity, plumbing, or a bathroom. He grew a small garden and hunted small animals like rabbits. He bathed in the river and lived what could only be described as a primitive lifestyle. Ted had a bike and would occasionally ride into the nearby town of Lincoln to visit the public library and read. Eventually, his money ran out, so he started doing odd jobs to get by. At one point, he even went back to Chicago to work at a telephone factory managed by his brother David. While working there, Ted fell for a female coworker. He confessed his feelings, and they went on a few dates. But because of Ted's strange behavior, the woman started to feel uneasy and ended the relationship. Ted took the rejection very personally and became extremely angry. The next day, David arrived at the factory to find more than 150 notes scattered all over the place, filled with crude and offensive poems targeting the woman. It was obvious Ted had written them. A major argument broke out between the brothers. David told Ted to clean up the mess and apologize, but Ted refused. The fight escalated, and David ended up firing his brother. After that, Ted immediately returned to his cabin in the forest and decided to stay there alone for the rest of his life. Despite this, he and David continued to exchange letters from time to time. But eventually, even that stopped. Years passed without David seeing or hearing from Ted. What David didn't know was that his brother was undergoing a deep transformation. Ted had become consumed by anger. He resented his parents for pushing him so hard academically and socially isolating him. He was angry at the woman who rejected him. He was bitter toward his brother David, especially after David got married. Ted felt the marriage had created a larger rift between them. Although Ted had never even met David's wife, he often criticized her in letters, accusing David of letting a woman control him and take him away from his family. This was one of the reasons their letters stopped. But beyond that, Ted was still holding on to the painful experiences he'd had at Harvard, which we'll get into later. And he was furious with society and the system for embracing technology and modern life. As we mentioned, his philosophy was staunchly anti-technology. All this anger and isolation eventually led him to one conclusion. He had to fight back against society. And that's when Ted decided to become the bomber. Ted, of course, being a genius in the scientific field, had knowledge across various sciences, including chemistry. He even had chemistry books in his cabin. After some study and experimentation, he managed to learn how to make bombs. Naturally, these weren't powerful bombs. They were considered weak and primitive, as he was still in the learning phase. But they were still bombs. Ted decided to use the postal system to send these bombs. He would place them in regular mail parcels and send them to his targets like any other package. But who were these targets and why did he choose them? We won't answer that just yet, but we'll get to it as the story unfolds. Ted carried out his first bombing on May 25, 1978. He targeted a university in Chicago called Northwestern. Specifically, he aimed at a professor named Buckley Christ, who worked in the mechanical engineering department. However, the package never reached the professor. A campus security guard found it lying in the parking lot. Suspecting something strange about the parcel, the guard decided to open it, and it immediately exploded in his hand, causing him injuries. The guard, of course, never imagined the package could be a bomb. Luckily, the explosion was very limited because the bomb didn't fully detonate. It was only a partial explosion, resulting in minor injuries. The police, security teams, and bomb specialists arrived at the scene and confirmed that it was a deliberately made bomb. Someone had manufactured it. However, it was very primitive. It consisted of a wooden box, black powder as the explosive material, and a basic ignition method using matchsticks. It was clear the bomb maker was no expert. An investigation was launched, but it led nowhere. The case was closed without any results. About a year later, the second bombing occurred on May 9, 1979, again targeting Northwestern University. This time, the bomb was left on a table inside one of the university rooms. It was in a mail parcel with no name on it, addressed simply to the university, making it accessible to anyone who might open it. It was a random target, but still within the university. Eventually, one of the students picked it up and opened it. It exploded in his face, causing minor burns and injuries. The bombs were still not very advanced, but this time the design was slightly different. The bomb's outer casing was again a wooden box, like the first one, but the ignition method involved wires and batteries. The explosive mixture was smokeless powder, similar to what's used in gun cartridges, combined with sulfur extracted from matchsticks. So again, it was a primitive bomb, but with a slightly different design, as if the bomber was experimenting. Police and bomb experts examined the device and its remains. After a brief investigation, they didn't reach any clear conclusions. They even thought it might just be a prank, especially since the damage wasn't significant. And the bomb was so crudely made that they didn't see the need for an in-depth investigation. No one linked this bomb to the first one, even though both incidents happened at the same university. Maybe that was because the bombs were weak and the time between the two attacks was a whole year. During the time Ted was distributing bombs, he was also writing a diary. He had a notebook where he recorded his thoughts and feelings about the bombs. What was strange, though, is that the entire diary consisted only of numbers, not a single word, just pages full of numbers. So even if someone happened to find the notebook, all they would see were numbers. As mentioned before, Ted was an extremely intelligent person and a mathematics professor. What he did was invent his own code to write using numbers. Each number represented a letter or a word. We know this now because the case has been solved, and the FBI managed to crack the code and understand the meanings behind the numbers and what they represented. So, Ted wrote his diary in this numeric code so that if someone, say a thief, entered his cabin and accidentally read the diary, or if it got lost or ended up in someone else's hands, no one would understand it. No one would grasp the contents. It would all look like just numbers. Later, when the FBI cracked the code and decoded what was written in the diary, they were able to uncover Ted's true thoughts and motivations regarding the bombs. After the second bomb exploded, Ted wrote in his journal, "I wish the explosion had blinded the victim, or blown off his hands, or at least disfigured him. I will learn more and make better bombs. I wish I had access to some dynamite." These were the words Ted wrote in his encrypted journal. It shows that Ted was disappointed with the results of his first and second bombs. He wanted to cause more destruction. He even wanted to kill, if he could. Ted's main advantage was his isolation from the world. No one knew anything about him. No one knew what he was doing. And he lived alone in a cabin deep in the forests of Montana. If he needed something, he would ride his primitive bicycle to the nearby town of Lincoln. Ted would go to the town to get the materials he needed to make his bombs. Sometimes, he would even break into cabins or storage sheds owned by others and steal bits of scrap, things no one would care about if they disappeared. Wires, pieces of metal, pipes, connectors, and such. All of it was basic and ordinary material that could be found anywhere. One of the places Ted often visited, or liked to visit, in town was the public library. It was a small library, fitting for a small town, and Ted enjoyed spending time there reading books. He even managed to befriend the library director and several town residents. The library director's son became his friend too, and Ted would help him with his math lessons. Everyone in town who got to know him thought he was a kind and friendly man. They had no idea about his true identity. At the time, Ted was preparing his third bomb, and this time, he decided to target an airplane. On November 15, 1979, an American Airlines flight took off from Chicago heading to Washington. The plane, of course, carried passengers as well as mail and cargo. Inside one of the parcels was Ted's bomb. After the plane took off and was in the air, the bomb suddenly exploded. It was located in the cargo hold, which is an isolated compartment. Fortunately, the explosion was weak, just like the previous bombs, so it didn't significantly affect the plane. However, it did cause a small fire in the cargo area, and smoke spread into the cabin. Some passengers even experienced mild suffocation. Worst of all, the explosion caused panic among the passengers, and the plane had to make an emergency landing. After this incident, the FBI was called in, since any attempted aircraft bombing falls under their jurisdiction. When they examined the remnants of the bomb and analyzed it, they found it had a wooden casing and was triggered by an altimeter, a device that measures altitude using air pressure. This meant the bomb was designed to detonate once the plane reached a certain height. In other words, the person who made it had intended to bring down the plane. Luckily, the bomb was too weak to achieve that. Ted himself wrote in his encrypted journal, the plan was to blow up the plane in midair, but unfortunately, it wasn't destroyed. The bomb was too weak. The FBI took the case very seriously. Attempting to bomb a plane is an extremely dangerous act, and they needed to act quickly to find out who was behind it. During their investigation, they reviewed any similar cases or bombings, especially in Chicago, the city where the plane took off. They found the two earlier bombing cases that had occurred at Northwestern University. Immediately, they linked the three bombs, the two university ones and the airplane bomb, and concluded that they had been made by the same person. That meant they were dealing with a serial bomber. Despite some differences between the three bombs, the style was consistent. Primitive devices with wooden casings and mostly similar components, even if the detonation mechanisms varied. The FBI's analysis suggested that the bomber was experimenting with different methods to make his bombs. It was clear he was a beginner, but actively learning and improving. This meant they had to find him quickly before he managed to build a truly destructive bomb and cause real harm. The biggest problem was that the FBI had no clues or leads to identify him. After examining the bomb remnants, they found no fingerprints, no hairs, nothing that could trace back to him. All components were clean. It was clear the bomber was meticulous and careful not to leave behind any evidence. 7 months after the plane bombing attempt, on June 10, 1980, the fourth bomb appeared. This time, the target was a man named Percy Wood, who was the president of United Airlines. That day, Percy went to check his mailbox and found a package from an unknown sender, along with a letter. In the letter, the sender claimed that the package contained a book of great social value and transformative ideas, that it would change his way of thinking. The message was clearly designed to entice him to open the book. Curious, Percy wanted to see what those great ideas were, so he opened the package and took out the book. As soon as he opened it, the bomb exploded in his face. The book had been hollowed out and turned into a bomb casing. It was rigged to explode the moment it was opened. A bomb inside a book. This was a new method the bomber was trying. Worse, this time, the explosion was much more powerful. The victim was nearly killed and suffered severe injuries. This bomb was far more violent than the previous ones. Delighted by this success, Ted wrote in his encrypted journal, "I feel better. I still have a lot of anger inside me, but now I have the ability to take revenge." Of course, what he meant was revenge against society, or the people he saw as symbols of progress and technology. This was the common thread among all of his targets. Of course, the FBI didn't know this at the time, and they started to feel the pressure mounting. If they couldn't identify the bomber quickly, these incidents would escalate, especially now that, apparently, the bomber had begun to build real bombs, ones with high destructive power. After examining the parts and remnants of the bomb, the FBI still didn't find any evidence that could lead them to the bomber. But this time, at least, they had a few leads they could follow. The first clue was a metal piece inside the bomb, engraved with the letters FC. At that point, the FBI had no idea what those letters meant, but they understood it was like a signature or mark that the bomber had deliberately left behind. The metal piece with the engraved letters had been protected inside the bomb in a way that clearly showed the bomber wanted it to remain intact. He wanted them to find it. He wanted them to see those letters. FC, it was like a signature, or even a challenge, from Ted. Ted would go on to use these letters to identify himself, as if he were telling them, "Any bomb you find in the future with these letters, that's mine." He wanted to take pride in his work, to taunt them. The letters were actually an abbreviation for Freedom Club, the alias Ted chose for himself and would later use in his future bombs, letters, and writings. We'll see more of this as the story unfolds. The important thing was that the FBI understood. Those letters were the bomber's signature, FC. The second clue the FBI had was the message the bomber sent with the bomb, which encouraged the victim to read a book, so they'd open it and trigger the explosion. This message was typed, not handwritten, but it was still the first sample of writing they got from the bomber. Ted had a typewriter in his cabin that he used regularly, and we'll see more of Ted's writings and that typewriter as we go deeper into the story. Even though the FBI had a couple of leads now, they were still lost. They tried to trace the origin of the packages, followed the postal stamps, and looked into where the parcels were sent from, but all of it led to dead ends. The bomber didn't leave any trace. When Ted mailed those parcels and letters, he never sent them from near his cabin or the nearby town. He would literally travel by bus to different states just to mail them. He was extremely cautious and always left a long gap between his attacks. After the fourth bomb, more than a year passed without any new incidents, but Ted returned with his fifth bomb on October 8, 1981. He traveled by bus to a city called Salt Lake City and went to a university there, the University of Utah, where he left the package containing his fifth bomb. This time, he personally delivered the package and left it in one of the university's hallways. It stayed there for a while until someone came across it, picked it up, and tried to open it to see what was inside. Fortunately, the bomb didn't explode this time. When the FBI got word, they came and immediately seized the device. Getting their hands on an unexploded bomb was a huge break in the case, allowing them to examine it and its contents thoroughly. It was clearly one of the bomber's devices, but the design was slightly different. This time, it was a container full of gasoline next to a small pipe bomb. The idea was that when the bomb exploded, the gasoline would ignite and spray onto the victim's face, burning them and either killing them or causing severe injuries. Naturally, the FBI and forensic analysts examined the bomb carefully, searching for fingerprints, traces, hairs, anything at all. But the device was clean. No evidence whatsoever. Now, the FBI's growing concern was that the bomber was expanding the scope of his operations. Until now, all the attacks had been in Chicago. But now he had reached Utah, which meant he didn't have a fixed area of activity. His next target could literally be anywhere. And that was a big problem. Ted would strike again with his sixth bomb on May 5, 1982. The bomb was sent in a package to Vanderbilt University in the state of Tennessee, a new state and a new university. The note was written in English and read, "Woo, it works. I told you it would. RV." As soon as the FBI saw that note, they immediately knew it was just a distraction tactic from the bomber. There was no way such a cautious bomber would leave anything inside the bomb that could identify him. And indeed, Ted had left them that note as mere bait to throw them off. But regardless, the FBI still had to check and investigate. They had to look into every person named Wu across all of America and see if any of them had connections with someone whose name started with the initials RV. That alone would open up a complex and lengthy investigation, scattering much of their efforts in the wrong direction. And they knew that. They knew it was a deliberate misdirection, but they had to follow through anyway. It was as if Ted was playing games with them, enjoying it. But in reality, Ted wasn't enjoying it that much. After this bombing, he wrote in his encrypted journal, "It's very frustrating that I can't build a truly lethal bomb." Meaning, Ted's goal was to kill his victims, and he was upset that he hadn't been able to achieve that. After the seventh bomb, Ted disappeared for a long time. He vanished for 3 years. The FBI were baffled by this disappearance. One of their theories was that the bomber was a criminal who might have been arrested for an unrelated charge or case and was now in prison. Of course, this theory was wrong. Ted simply wanted to take a break to improve and enhance his bombs. He wanted to build deadly, lethal explosives, so he spent all those years experimenting. Most of his experiments were done in the forest, and even some nearby townsfolk said they sometimes heard what sounded like distant explosions coming from the woods. After the case was uncovered, they realized those were likely Ted's test blasts. During his disappearance, Ted also had a few adventures in the town. For example, there was a man named Butch Gehring, one of the townspeople, who owned a sawmill. He used to cut down trees in the forest and operate the mill with heavy machinery. Ted absolutely hated him. He despised him for chopping trees and polluting the environment with his machines and smoke, not to mention the loud noise. The sawmill was also somewhat close to Ted's cabin. It was near the path he took when heading to town. Every time he passed by, he'd be disgusted and irritated. So Ted decided to destroy the sawmill. One night, without anyone noticing, he brought bags of sand and poured them into the main engine of the sawmill machinery. So when they turned it on, the sand would spread throughout the machine and completely wreck it. In the end, the sawmill owner had to pay a high price to fix it, losing a lot of money that year. And he had absolutely no idea who was behind it. He thought it might have been a prank by some kids. Another thing Ted did during his disappearance was attack some bikers. There was a group of young men who rode their dirt bikes through the forest trails as a hobby or sport. Of course, these rally bikes were extremely noisy, and they raced through the woods like madmen. Ted got furious. He saw their behavior as a violation of his privacy, his isolation, and his peace. The bikers even had their own cabin in the forest, bigger and better equipped than Ted's. They had a generator, electricity, a bathroom. Everything was in order. One night, Ted grabbed an axe from his cabin, went over, and broke into their cabin, not through the door, but by making a hole in the wall. Then he wrecked everything inside. Literally, he left no piece of furniture intact, destroyed every single item, and in the end, defecated inside the cabin and left. So even though Ted claimed he wanted a peaceful, isolated life, he was actually living out adventures in the woods and the nearby town, all while continuing to improve and refine his bombs. One of the things he did was change the explosive mixture inside his devices. Instead of relying on gunpowder, he started using a mix of ammonium nitrate and aluminum powder. This blend, of course, was much more explosive and not easy to make. It required effort. After 3 years of disappearing, the bomber returned with his 8th bomb on May 15, 1985. The target location was the same as the previous bomb, the University of California in Berkeley, which, as we mentioned before, is the same university where Ted worked as a professor. Ted placed his bomb once again in the electrical engineering department. One of the students saw the bomb, and his curiosity led him to approach and open it. As soon as he opened it, it exploded violently in his face. The student suffered severe injuries and burns. Imagine, he lost 4 fingers from his right hand and ended up with a literal hole in his arm. His injuries were truly brutal. The FBI came to examine the scene and the bomb remnants. As with previous bombings, they didn't find anything new. But once again, they found the bomber's signature, FC, etched into the bomb components, confirming that it was the same bomber and that he had come out of a 3-year hibernation. It also seemed that his bombs had become more powerful and dangerous. This was the first time a victim had been injured to this degree. 4 fingers blown off and a gaping wound in the arm. The next attack came quickly, just 1 month later. On June 13, 1985, Ted sent his 9th bomb, this time inside a mail package addressed to Boeing's headquarters in Washington. Boeing, of course, is the company that manufactures airplanes. The package wasn't addressed to a specific person, just the company. The company's mailroom staff noticed the package and found it suspicious, especially since it was somewhat heavy. They were cautious in handling it because they were aware of the bomber's case. None of them opened it. Instead, they had it scanned with an X-ray. Immediately, they realized it was a bomb and called the FBI. The FBI came, seized the bomb, disarmed it, and confirmed it was one of the bomber's devices, especially after finding the engraved letters FC inside. However, this bomb, like the ones before it, provided no new leads. 5 months later, the bomber sent his 10th bomb on November 15, 1985. This time, the target was the University of Michigan, a university we talked about at the beginning of the story because it's where Ted studied after graduating from Harvard and earned his PhD in mathematics. Ted sent a bomb package to this university addressed to a professor named James McConnell. The package arrived at the professor's office along with a letter. The professor opened the letter to read it while his assistant, who was also in the office, took the package and started opening it. The professor began reading the letter, which said, "I'm a PhD student, and I hope you'll read this book I sent you. Someone in your position should definitely read this book." As the professor read the letter, the assistant opened the package, and the bomb exploded in his face. The assistant suffered serious injuries, and the professor, who was standing a little farther away, partially lost his hearing. Both were harmed, but the assistant was hurt more severely. Interestingly, this professor wasn't a professor of electrical engineering, computer science, or any tech-related field. He was a professor of psychology, a psychologist. It was strange for Ted to target him. Even the FBI, when they arrived and investigated the scene and the victims, were puzzled. Why would the bomber go after a psychology professor? That wasn't his usual target. They even began to wonder whether the bomber was now targeting universities in general, regardless of the department or specialization. What the FBI didn't know at the time was that this particular bombing was driven by personal motives, unlike the previous ones. Ted had a personal connection with the psychology professor he targeted. In his encrypted journals, Ted wrote that in 1962, while he was working on his PhD at the University of Michigan, dark thoughts started to take over his mind. So he went to see this psychologist, James McConnell, hoping for help. But according to Ted's journals, the doctor tried to convince him he was mentally ill and pushed him to take medications to control his mind. As Ted described it, this made him extremely angry. Ted even wrote that he used to dream about killing this doctor, strangling him with his own hands, and that he'd feel great relief after killing him in the dream. In other words, Ted's murderous and destructive thoughts had been with him since that time. But since he was intelligent and cautious, he was able to control himself and didn't act on those urges until the right opportunity came, after he isolated himself from the world and cut off contact with society to avoid raising suspicion. That's the reason he remained at large for so long, because despite the rage inside him, he was always cautious and smart in his movements. So the reason Ted targeted this professor was personal. He held a deep grudge against him. Ted would return again to bombing less than a month later, with his 11th bomb on December 11, 1985. This time, the target was in Sacramento, California. But this time, Ted didn't just build a powerful bomb. He added a new feature. He designed it to release shrapnel upon detonation. He packed it with nails and metal fragments to cause as many injuries as possible. He placed the bomb in the rear parking lot of a computer store, next to the cars. The bomb was hidden in a wooden box with 4 nails protruding from it. Ted targeted this store because it sold computers and electronic devices. It was a technology business. During the lunch break, the store owner came out the back door and saw the wooden box on the ground. He found it strange, approached it, and decided to pick it up. And the bomb exploded instantly. The blast was violent. The nails and shrapnel tore into the man's body, leaving a massive hole in his chest. He died on the spot. Hugh Scruton, the computer store owner, became the bomber's first fatality. What the FBI had feared all these years had finally happened. The bomber had claimed a life. Now the pressure on them multiplied. And the problem was, they still had nothing. They were chasing clues here and there, but everything led to dead ends. The bomber remained extremely cautious and never left a trace behind. After this bombing, Ted wrote in his encrypted journals, "Excellent. The bomb finally achieved its purpose. A very humane way to kill someone. He probably didn't feel a thing." Clearly, Ted was pleased that his bomb had finally killed someone. The FBI began allocating more resources and manpower to the case, fearing that the bomber would increase the pace of his attacks, especially after his first successful killing. But contrary to their expectations, the bomber vanished again for a while. It seemed Ted was so satisfied with this operation that he decided to take a break. A year and 2 months later, Ted came back with his 12th bomb on February 20, 1987. The target was the same as before, a computer store, but this time it was in Salt Lake City, Utah, far away from the first store. The only thing the 2 stores had in common was that they sold computers. But this time, an employee working at the store saw Ted placing the bomb in the parking lot in front of the shop. Of course, at that moment, she didn't know it was a bomb. She saw a strange man wearing a hoodie and sunglasses placing a wooden box next to the cars. It was an odd thing to do, unusual behavior, but it never crossed her mind that it could be a bomb. So she went back to work and forgot about it. About an hour later, the store owner, whose name was Gary Wright, took out the trash and left the store to throw it away. On his way back, he saw the strange box and curiosity got the better of him, so he went over and picked it up. And the moment he lifted it, the bomb exploded violently. He was severely injured, but miraculously survived. This was the same type of bomb that had killed the previous victim. Just a single nail or piece of shrapnel going in the wrong direction, hitting his head or chest, could have killed him. But luckily, most of the shrapnel and nails hit the lower part of his body, so he was able to survive, although his injuries were serious and he even lost some fingers. After this attack, Ted wrote in his encrypted journal, "The bomb detonated well, but the result was unsatisfactory." The FBI immediately arrived at the crime scene and began investigating. Initially, they were excited because they found forensic evidence in the remains of the bomb. They found hair, not just 1 or 2 strands, but a lot. But they quickly realized that the hair came from different people and that the bomber had deliberately planted it in the bomb to mislead them. Ted had intentionally done this. He went to public restrooms, collected hair from various individuals, and placed it in the bomb to throw off the FBI or mock them. Still, the investigators had a strong lead this time. The witness, the store employee, who had clearly seen the bomber placing the device in the parking lot. She got a good look at his face, so the FBI brought in a sketch artist and created composite sketches of the bomber. They immediately went to the media and published the sketch everywhere. It was as if they were thrilled that they had finally found something in the case. For the first time in all these years, they had a real lead that could point them to the bomber. The sketch was printed in newspapers and shown in every news broadcast and press conference related to the case. Its release reignited the case in the media. The case had already been famous from the start, but now the whole country was talking about it. Even international media outlets began covering it. But what the FBI didn't know was that Ted had taken precautions even for this scenario. When Ted went out on his bombing missions, he shaved his beard and only left a small mustache. He knew there was a chance someone might see him planting a bomb. After completing a mission, he would return to his cabin and isolate himself in the woods until his beard fully grew back. He literally wouldn't leave the cabin, not to the town or anywhere else, until his beard was long again. This was one of the routines he always followed in his operations, showing how careful and calculated he was. Everything he did was meticulously planned. But in any case, after the sketch was released, Ted disappeared for a long time. He vanished for 6 years and didn't carry out any new bombings during that entire period. It seems Ted was frightened. This was the first time someone had seen him, and for someone as cautious as him, that was a serious development. So he decided to halt his operations indefinitely. During those 6 years, Ted lived in his cabin. Sometimes he would go into town, visit the library to read a few books, go on small adventures here and there like the ones we saw earlier, tend to his garden, hunt small animals in the forest, and take walks in nature. That was his life. The FBI hoped they'd get new leads after releasing the sketch, but the case remained stagnant with no progress. When the 6 years passed without any new bombings, the FBI began to believe they'd never hear from the bomber again. They assumed, just like they had in the early days, that he might have been arrested for another crime or maybe even died, possibly blown up while testing a bomb. But before the FBI could fully believe that theory, the bomber struck again with his 13th bomb on June 22, 1993. The target this time was a geneticist named Dr. Charles Epstein, who lived in California. The doctor arrived at his home and found a package in his mailbox. It wasn't from anyone he knew, but it had his name on it. It wasn't unusual for him to receive packages or letters from strangers, as he was a well-known scientist in his field, and sometimes received mail or even gifts from students or colleagues who appreciated his work or wanted to contact him. So he didn't find it suspicious. Also, keep in mind, the bomber had been gone for 6 years, so people had forgotten and let their guard down. The scientist took the package inside, and his wife and daughter were in the living room. He chatted with them for a bit and told them he had received a package and didn't know who had sent it. His wife even joked, saying, "Oh, should I be worried about your secret admirers now too?" He laughed at her joke, took the package, and went into his room. Moments later, a violent explosion shook the house. The scientist suffered extremely serious injuries. He lost 3 fingers, and his eardrums were severely and permanently damaged. He partially lost his hearing. Despite everything, he was lucky to survive, because this bomb was stronger and more violent than the previous ones. It was clear that the bomber had made major improvements to his explosives during those 6 years. The FBI immediately declared an emergency. Had the bomber really returned after all these years, or was it a copycat? What was going on? Before the FBI even had time to reopen the case, another explosion occurred. This time, Ted struck quickly. Just 2 days later, he sent bomb number 14 on June 24, 1993. The target was a computer science professor named David Gelernter at Yale University in Connecticut. The professor arrived at his office and received a package from his secretary. The package was identical to the one sent to the previous victim 2 days earlier. In fact, Ted had sent both packages at the same time, but this one was delayed due to the greater distance. The professor opened the package and it immediately exploded in his face. Like the previous victim, he suffered serious injuries. One of his eyes was badly damaged, and he lost the ability to properly use his right hand due to nerve damage caused by the blast. These bombings dominated the news. Everyone was talking about the bomber's return after a 6-year absence. 2 back-to-back attacks, something he had never done before. Panic spread quickly, and people became afraid to open their mail. The FBI relaunched their investigation with full force and established a special task force to pursue the bomber. It included 150 FBI agents and became the largest task force ever assembled to catch a single man in FBI history. At the time, it became the most extensive and expensive investigation the FBI had ever undertaken. After forensic specialists examined the 2 bombs, they discovered that the bomber had begun using a new explosive mixture made from chlorate. This substance didn't require pipes in the bomb to detonate, which marked a major development in his bomb-making technique. Within hours of the second bombing, a message arrived at the New York Times, one of the most prominent newspapers in the U.S. The message was from the bomber and consisted of a short note in which he wrote, "We are an anarchist group calling ourselves SC." The bomber was portraying himself as part of a group rather than a lone individual, or perhaps he simply meant that he considered himself a group or organization. The letter also stated that the date it was sent preceded a significant event, referring to the 2 recent bombings. In fact, the message was postmarked before the attacks, meaning it had been mailed before the bombs went off but only arrived afterward. In the message, the sender claimed that this group, called FC, was responsible for the bombings and publicly took credit for them. He also wrote that the FBI was aware of the initials FC, which had been found on the bombs. Importantly, the FBI had never released this detail to the public. The fact that the bomber signed his devices with FC was classified. By revealing this in his message, the bomber was essentially proving his identity to the New York Times journalists and attempting to establish a direct line of communication with them. The bomber also wrote that he would provide more information about his goals in the future. At the end of the message, he included a unique identifying number: 553,254,394. He explained that this number should be kept secret and used to verify future communications. So, if the Times or the FBI received another message with that number, they would immediately recognize it as being from him. The New York Times promptly informed the FBI, who confirmed that the message had indeed been sent before the bombings, reinforcing its authenticity. This marked a major turning point in the case, as it was the first time the bomber expressed a desire to communicate and share his motives. Up to that point, the FBI was still lost and confused. They didn't understand his motives or why he was targeting people with no obvious connection, except that they were doctors, scientists, or worked in the computer and tech industries. One theory they had was that the targets were almost randomly selected, possibly by someone mentally unstable, bitter at the education system or academia for having failed in his own studies. But the FBI's analysis couldn't have been further from the truth. While the message didn't fully explain the bomber's motives, it introduced a new possibility: that the bomber might be a group of people rather than a single individual. Still, the FBI leaned toward the theory that it was just one person. After all, it seemed implausible that a group could cover its tracks so flawlessly for so many years. If there were multiple people involved, surely some evidence would have surfaced. So the main working theory remained: one person, acting alone. The way the bomber described himself, as part of an anarchist group, was significant. Anarchists or anarchist groups typically oppose governmental systems and societal structures. They aim to destroy the current order and rebuild it. Some even have environmental leanings, rejecting technological progress and modern industry. This offered the FBI clues into the bomber's ideology, and they began to understand him a little better. The investigation continued, but the case remained cold, with no new leads or bombings for a year and a half. At this time, Ted, the bomber, was frustrated by the outcomes of his last two attacks. After a 6-year hiatus, he had hoped to return with a powerful impact. Though the bombings were more destructive and caused serious injuries, they didn't achieve what he intended: killing. In his encrypted journal, Ted wrote that he was disappointed with the results. This likely led him to disappear again for another 1.5 years. But he would return, with bomb number 15 on December 10, 1994. This time, his target was different: Thomas Moser, an executive at an advertising company in New Jersey. In his journal, Ted explained that the reason he chose Moser was because his firm had done PR work for Exxon, an oil company Ted viewed as an environmental destroyer. As usual, he mailed the bomb in a package addressed directly to Moser. The package didn't raise any alarms. Moser was, after all, an advertising executive and regularly received mail from various people and institutions. The package was labeled as being from the economics department at the University of San Francisco. When Moser opened it, a powerful explosion was triggered. The blast was so intense that it decapitated him instantly. Ted had finally reached the level of destruction he had aimed for from the beginning. In his journal, he wrote that he was satisfied with the bomb's deadly success. The FBI was under immense pressure, politically, from the media and from the public. Despite launching the largest investigation in their history, they hadn't been able to identify a single suspect or even find a trace. It was deeply frustrating. Thousands of tips poured in from all over the country. People who thought they knew the bomber, suspected someone in their circle, or just had hunches. Most of these leads were useless, but the FBI had to follow up on as many as possible, fearing that a real clue might be buried among them. Despite all their resources, the FBI was still groping in the dark. Here's an example that shows the extent of their efforts. In the message to the New York Times, they found an impression on the envelope, as if someone had written a note on a paper placed over it, leaving a faint imprint. The phrase was, "Call Nathan R." The FBI believed this could be a mistake by the bomber himself, possibly a note he jotted while preparing the envelope. To investigate, they attempted to contact every person named Nathan R. in the U.S., meaning anyone named Nathan whose last name began with an R. There were thousands of such people, and the FBI contacted over 10,000 of them. But ultimately, this lead went nowhere. They concluded that the message was likely just a decoy planted by the bomber. This gives you an idea of the sheer amount of resources and manpower the FBI poured into the case, just for one misleading phrase out of countless other investigations they were conducting, all of which led to dead ends. 5 months later, the bomber struck again with bomb number 16 on April 24, 1995. This time, the target was Gilbert Murray, head of the California Forestry Association, an organization responsible for regulating logging while managing forest resources. Ted viewed them as environmental villains and decided to target Murray. He mailed a bomb to him, and when Murray opened the package, his office was instantly turned into a scene of devastation. It was the most powerful bomb yet. Murray was literally blown to pieces and died instantly. The level of destruction shocked even the FBI. Everything in the office was incinerated. It was a new level of violence, unlike any of the previous attacks. The news spread rapidly across all media outlets. Every channel and newspaper covered the story. Fear and panic gripped the nation. The bomber had now shown that he could kill with ease, and his bombs had become terrifyingly lethal. The last 2 bombings had claimed lives instantly. Public paranoia surged. People became terrified of opening their mail. Whenever someone received a package, they'd inspect it carefully, checking for bulges, odd smells, powdery residues, or greasy marks. Some would even sniff their packages or feel them all over, trying any way they could to detect a bomb. That's how scared the public had become. The FBI even offered a $1 million reward for anyone who could provide information leading to the bomber. During Ted's years of isolation in his cabin, he wrote a 56-page manifesto containing 35,000 words, all typed on his typewriter. In this booklet, he laid out all his ideas, ideologies, and views on society and technological development. On June 25, 1995, Ted sent this booklet along with a 3-page letter to the New York Times. In this letter, he spoke as if he were representing a group called FC, an abbreviation he explained stood for Freedom Club. At the beginning of the letter, he wrote, "We are the terrorist group FC." His own words. He explicitly labeled the group as terrorist and claimed responsibility, in the plural, for the last 2 bombings that had killed victims. To prove his identity, he included the same number used in his previous letter, 553,254,394, a number known only to the New York Times and the FBI, thus confirming his authorship. In this letter, the bomber harshly criticized the FBI, calling them incompetent and a joke, accusing them of trying to portray him in the media as a fool or a madman, which he strongly denied. He clarified that his main targets were scientists and individuals working in the tech sector, those pushing humanity toward a technology-dependent lifestyle. He also acknowledged the pain he had caused innocent people, like the secretary who opened a bomb meant for a professor, or the assistant who opened another in place of the intended target. Ted considered these people innocent and expressed regret, especially for an earlier attempt to bring down an airplane. He admitted he was younger and more immature at the time, and said he was glad the bomb failed, realizing now that the plane likely carried innocent people. However, he remained adamant that his other attacks were justified. He believed the 2 people who died deserved it, and many of those injured as well. In this message, Ted seemed to be portraying his actions as noble and purposeful. The most important part of the letter was at the end, where Ted proposed a deal. If the booklet he enclosed was published in full in the newspaper, he would stop all future bombings. That was the offer he made to the New York Times. He also sent the same offer and a copy of the Manifesto to the Washington Post, another major newspaper. Both papers immediately contacted the FBI due to the national security implications. They couldn't publish anything without FBI approval. Upon reading the Manifesto, the FBI was shocked by its content. It was written with clarity and intellectual rigor, showing that its author was neither crazy nor incoherent, as they had assumed. The Manifesto was organized like a PhD thesis or a serious academic paper. The core message of the Manifesto was a strong opposition to technology and modern society's growing reliance on it. Ted described technology as an evil force, luring people in with the promise of freedom and a better life, only to enslave them. He justified the killings and bombings as a necessary way to grab the public's attention and convey his message. That, in his mind, explained his crimes. Now the FBI faced a dilemma. Should they publish the Manifesto, meet the bomber's demand, and hope he would keep his word, or refuse and risk further attacks? This sparked heated debates within the FBI. Some argued that negotiating with a criminal was unacceptable, while others believed publishing the Manifesto could save lives if the bomber stayed true to his word. There was also a chance that someone familiar with the bomber might recognize his writing style and come forward. Initially, the FBI leadership was against publishing, but eventually they concluded that the Manifesto's tone suggested its author took pride in his words and likely would honor his promise. If he broke it, his credibility would be destroyed. So they decided that publication might be the safest option and potentially a key to identifying him. And so, on September 19, 1995, the Washington Post published the full Manifesto, all 56 pages and every word. That day, the newspaper sold out across the country. Everyone was eager to read it, as the case had become one of the most talked about stories in America. After the Manifesto was published, the number of tips pouring into the FBI skyrocketed. People across the country began to suspect friends, acquaintances, even family members might be the bomber. The flood of reports overwhelmed the FBI task force, which struggled to keep up. Among those who read the Manifesto was a woman named Ted Kaczynski. Wait, Kaczynski. Who was she? Linda was the wife of David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother. We talked about David earlier. He and Ted had been very close in their youth, and even into adulthood. David had helped Ted build his cabin in the woods, but later their relationship deteriorated, especially after a falling out at a telephone company where Ted had worked, and where a woman Ted had feelings for rejected him. After that, David never saw Ted again. More than 20 years had passed without any contact. They had exchanged a few letters after the argument, but even that faded with time. David had no idea where his brother was or what he had become. Their mother, who was still alive at the time, had also exchanged some letters with Ted, but eventually he cut her off too. Ted had completely severed ties with his family, so they had no clue he might be the bomber. But when Linda read the manifesto, she immediately noticed a similarity between the bomber's ideas and Ted's. Ironically, Linda had never met or spoken to Ted. She married David after Ted had already become isolated. In Ted's last letters to David, he had criticized the marriage, writing things like, "You've let a woman turn you into her property. She made you abandon your principles. And your brother. She controls you in a disgusting way." Ted hated their relationship and described Linda in extremely harsh terms, even though he had never met her. In the final letter Ted sent to David, he told him he didn't want any more contact, didn't want to hear anything about him. And that was the end of it. No more letters. From then on, Ted became the bomber and continued his attacks for 18 years. During all that time, he rarely, if ever, communicated with his brother or mother. He had almost completely cut them off. From early on, Linda had the impression that Ted wasn't mentally stable, that he had psychological and emotional issues. She repeatedly told her husband, David, that his brother clearly needed help and professional treatment. But David would often dismiss her concerns, insisting that Ted was just difficult to understand. A brilliant mind with social challenges, someone who was simply different. Still, Linda wasn't convinced. She had read Ted's letters to his mother and brother, and she felt that no mentally stable person, regardless of intelligence, would think or express themselves the way Ted did. Even before Ted became the infamous bomber, Linda had already sensed he harbored deep hatred for modern society, especially its obsession with technology. His writings were filled with rants against technological progress, and he often expressed his disdain for the direction society was heading. This, she believed, was the very reason he chose to isolate himself in a remote cabin in the woods and cut off ties with the civilized world. So when Linda read the manifesto that had been published by the bomber in the Washington Post, Ted immediately came to her mind. The ideas in the manifesto were eerily familiar, exactly like Ted's. She went to David and asked him if he had read the bomber's manifesto. He hadn't. He said he wasn't particularly interested in the case, but Linda insisted that something about it felt disturbingly close to home. She told David that the content of the manifesto almost perfectly mirrored Ted's beliefs and tone. David was skeptical, even shocked by the suggestion, but Linda urged him to read it for himself. As David began reading the manifesto, Linda observed his expression change. His jaw slowly dropped, his eyes widened, and a look of disbelief overtook his face. What he was reading didn't just echo Ted's beliefs, it matched his exact writing style, sentence structure, and use of vocabulary. When he finished reading, David was still trying to deny the possibility. The thought that his own brother, quiet, reclusive Ted, could be the country's most wanted domestic terrorist was almost impossible to accept. But he also knew that if he ignored the signs and Ted truly was the bomber, then any future victim's blood would be on his hands. On the other hand, if he dug deeper and confirmed his suspicion, he would face the unbearable reality of having to report his own brother to the authorities. Encouraged by Linda, the two began a painstaking comparison between Ted's old letters and the published manifesto. They laid out all the correspondence David had saved from Ted and began their own investigation. The deeper they looked, the more undeniable the similarities became. The same themes, the same phrases, the same thought patterns. David even went to his mother's home and retrieved the letters Ted had sent her over the years. Those letters, too, aligned with the tone and ideas in the manifesto. But it didn't stop there. When they looked into the bomber's previous attacks, they discovered an unsettling overlap with Ted's personal history. 2 bombings had taken place at the University of California, Berkeley, the very university where Ted had once taught as a professor. Another occurred at the University of Michigan, where Ted had earned his doctorate. These weren't coincidences. Then came the final, most damning discovery. While going through old documents, David found a lengthy manuscript Ted had written in 1971. The ideas and philosophical arguments in that document were virtually identical to those in the bomber's manifesto. Same structure, same reasoning, same voice. It was as if that old manuscript had been the rough draft for what later became the infamous manifesto. For David, there was no longer any doubt. At this point, David had no choice but to face the reality. His brother was most likely the bomber. He had to force himself to contact the FBI and report him. So David called the dedicated hotline for the bomber case and submitted a tip. He also faxed them copies of some of his brother's letters to compare them with the bomber's manifesto. David expected a quick response, but a week passed, then 2, then 3, with no word from the FBI. This was likely due to the fact that the task force handling the case, despite its size and resources, was receiving thousands of tips. At one point, the list of suspects compiled from those tips had grown to over 2,400 names, and Ted was at the very bottom since David's tip had come in late. After more than a month without a response, David reached out again, this time requesting to speak directly with someone in the task force leadership. The officer he spoke with initially told him they were working through the tips one by one and would eventually get to his. But David insisted that he take a look at the letters he'd sent. The officer did so and immediately saw that David's claims were highly credible. He forwarded the call to one of the task force leaders, who also reviewed the letters and quickly recognized the striking similarities. The FBI immediately prioritized David's tip, began thoroughly reviewing Ted's letters and documents, and even sent agents to David's home to collect the original copies. Overnight, Ted Kaczynski became the FBI's prime suspect. After analyzing all the letters and documents, the FBI found hundreds of similarities with the manifesto, parallels in ideas, philosophy, writing style, structure, everything. Then, by investigating Ted's background and past, they were able to match his movements with those of the bomber. From there, they formed a special team tasked with monitoring Ted. At that point, they still had no definitive evidence to arrest him, only linguistic and stylistic similarities, which weren't enough for an arrest. However, they suspected that his cabin deep in the forest would likely contain all the evidence they needed. But to search it, they'd need a warrant from a judge, a process that could take several days. In the meantime, they sent a team to begin surveillance on Ted. Several agents traveled to the small town of Lincoln in western Montana. Once there, they asked around, and the locals confirmed that Ted was probably up in his cabin. He hadn't been seen in a while. That wasn't unusual, they said. Ted often spent long periods, even months, isolated in the forest withoed coming into town. Some of the agents dressed in civilian clothes and ventured into the woods to locate the cabin and get a sense of the terrain. Meanwhile, the FBI contacted local authorities, including a Forest Service officer named Jerry Burns, who happened to know Ted personally. Burns had occasionally visited Ted's cabin and exchanged small talk with him, so they were acquainted on a basic level. The FBI asked Jerry to help with the arrest, explaining that they believed Ted was the bomber, the most wanted man in America. Burns was shocked but agreed to cooperate fully. The FBI monitored the cabin for several days while preparing for the arrest. Once the warrant came through, a large operation was set into motion. More than 100 agents and officers from the FBI and special forces were deployed, a full-scale operation for this small town. At dawn on April 3, 1996, they mobilized into the forest. Special forces and tactical teams spread out through the trees surrounding the cabin area. However, these units were just backup. The plan was not to storm the cabin outright, since Ted was known to own a rifle and could resist arrest violently. Or worse, the cabin might be rigged with explosives. The goal was to catch him off guard and arrest him without confrontation. The arrest plan involved 3 people approaching the cabin: an FBI leader, a senior local law enforcement officer, and Jerry Burns, the forest ranger. All were dressed in civilian clothing except Burns, who wore his usual uniform. The idea was for Burns to lure Ted out using their familiarity. As they approached, Burns began calling out, "Ted, are you there? It's Jerry. I've got 2 men here from a drilling company, and we need to ask you a few questions." Ted took the bait. He opened the cabin door and looked outside. Burns greeted him and explained that the men were from a company called Nordic Drilling, looking to lease rights in the area, and wanted to confirm the property lines so they wouldn't trespass on his land. Ted paused for a moment, studying their faces. The 2 men looked older and convincingly like they could work for a drilling company. He replied, "All right, give me a moment to grab my shoes." But as soon as he turned his back, Burns grabbed him and pulled him outside. The other 2 quickly moved in, pinned him to the ground, and arrested him. The FBI officer identified himself and told Ted he was under arrest and that they had a warrant to search his cabin. Eventually, the bomber was arrested, and the images you're seeing are real photographs of the moment of his capture. The news of the arrest quickly spread across all media outlets. It was the biggest story in America at the time. Journalists and news stations were literally at the cabin from the very first moments because the news had leaked. The FBI and specialized bomb squads entered the cabin and began their search. The place turned out to be a goldmine, packed with all kinds of evidence needed to confirm his guilt. They found the typewriter he used, materials for making bombs, notebooks and diaries full of notes and writings, even handwritten instructions on how to construct bombs. They also discovered drafts or early versions of his manifesto and clothing items including a hoodie and glasses that perfectly matched the police sketch based on eyewitness descriptions. The volume of evidence found inside the cabin was overwhelming. While searching, one FBI agent pulled a box from under the bed. It was inside a plastic bag. When they opened the bag, they found a small box wrapped completely in aluminum foil. One of the agents picked it up and began inspecting it. Suddenly, his instincts kicked in. He gently set the box down and told his colleagues to back away immediately. Bomb experts were called in and, after inspection, confirmed that it was indeed a live bomb. Had they made a wrong move or tried to open the box, it would have exploded. This turned out to be the last bomb Ted had made, fully ready and likely intended for his next victim. Thankfully, he was arrested before he could send it out. The bomb squad was able to safely dismantle and defuse it. The FBI and other security teams continued to search the cabin for days, combing through every inch. They retrieved and documented every single item they could find. The cabin became the primary witness in one of the most infamous criminal cases in modern history. Following the arrest, there was an enormous media frenzy. After 18 years, the elusive bomber who had frustrated the FBI was finally in custody. Ted Kaczynski's name was suddenly on everyone's lips. Every news outlet and newspaper covered the story relentlessly. There wasn't a single person in the country who hadn't heard about him. Even his family, his brother and mother, seen in the footage, became targets of intense media attention. They were hounded by cameras wherever they went. At this point, the public began digging into Ted's past, and people were shocked by his story. How could someone so brilliant, a top academic, a math prodigy, a former university professor, turn into a serial bomber? This fueled the media storm even further. People became fascinated, eager to understand who he really was and what events led him down this dark path. Eventually, some truths began to emerge. It came to light that Ted had experienced disturbing situations during his time at Harvard, which may have planted the seeds of his destructive ideology. Ideas about violence, destruction, and anti-technology sentiment. He entered Harvard at just 16, the youngest among his peers, which amplified his sense of isolation. His classmates didn't really accept him, not only because he was younger, but also because he was more intelligent. During his time at the university, Ted attended lectures by a professor named Henry Murray, the head of the psychology department at Harvard. Murray was a renowned psychologist and a highly respected academic figure. Students admired him deeply. He was seen as a role model in both academic and personal life. His way of speaking, his ideas, and his presence had a magnetic pull. Many students hoped to get closer to him, and he would occasionally distribute psychological tests to select those he deemed worthy of entering his inner circle. Ted was among those who eagerly sought that connection. Over time, Professor Murray began to notice Ted's brilliance and started giving him special attention. This was something Ted desperately craved, especially given his feelings of loneliness. Their relationship grew, and Ted began visiting Murray's office almost daily. They had long discussions about life, philosophy, and personal matters. Ted opened up entirely, sharing thoughts about his family, ambitions, fears, and dreams. Murray listened and engaged, treating him almost like a close friend. Since his early years, Ted had held strong views against technology and progress. He was a boy who loved nature and embraced a simple life, believing that technology was ruining people's lives and enslaving them. These ideas were ingrained in him long before darker, more criminal thoughts ever took root. Ted often shared and discussed these beliefs with Professor Henry, who would listen respectfully and even acknowledge some of the points Ted raised. What Ted didn't know, however, was that Professor Henry had secret ties to the CIA. He was unaware that the CIA had enlisted Henry to conduct experiments on students, especially those who were close to him, like Ted. It's likely that Henry had drawn Ted in precisely to use him for these psychological experiments, having seen in him both brilliance and clear signs of social difficulties, loneliness, isolation, and detachment, making him a suitable target for such studies. As their relationship grew stronger, Henry eventually convinced Ted to participate in one of these experiments. One day in 1958, he took Ted into a dark room, an underground basement on campus, hooked his body up to wires and sensors to monitor his vital responses, something akin to a polygraph machine, but more complex. Then, he turned off the lights and aimed a harsh spotlight directly at Ted's face. At first, Ted didn't grasp what was happening. He thought it would be a standard experiment, but suddenly, he found himself strapped to a chair in a dim room, wires attached to his body, surrounded by an atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation or torture session. Without warning, Professor Henry brought in a group of psychologists, some of them professors at Harvard, others from outside the university. All had come to observe this experiment. Ted was confused but still tried to remain optimistic, thinking it might be an intriguing study. Then everything changed. The warm, friendly professor Ted had known turned cold and confrontational. He began interrogating Ted about his beliefs, especially those related to technology and progress, aggressively challenging them as if putting him on trial. He subjected Ted's ideas to harsh scrutiny, even playing back video recordings from their earlier conversations, recordings Ted hadn't known existed. He dismantled Ted's beliefs with brutal critique, attacking them one by one. At just 16, Ted was overwhelmed. Even when he tried to speak or respond, he found himself unable to. Professor Henry continued, saying he had shared Ted's views with the other doctors present, and that they had all come to the same conclusion. Ted's ideas were laughable and regressive, mere fantasies of a child desperate to feel unique. They said his beliefs were just recycled scraps of irrelevant philosophies from forgotten books, and that he, Ted, was a nobody, adding nothing of value to any of it. At this point, you might be wondering, what was this professor doing? Why was he conducting all of this? What was the purpose of the experiment? The answer is that this experiment was carried out under the directives of the CIA, which at the time was conducting psychological experiments aimed at controlling human minds and performing brainwashing. Most people know that in the 1950s, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was intensifying. It was a race for technological and scientific advancement, and the Americans were aware that the Soviets were conducting experiments in psychology and brainwashing. So they wanted to stay ahead in that field. Some of these experiments even involved the use of mind-altering substances like LSD. The goal of these experiments was to find ways to break a person down, dismantle their beliefs, and brainwash them to make them more easily manipulated, interrogated, and mined for information. This was part of a secret CIA program that ran from 1952 to 1973, known as MK Ultra, which was officially declassified in 1975. So this wasn't just a conspiracy theory, it was a real, acknowledged program. They admitted to conducting these experiments in various institutions, including universities, to explore methods of mind control and psychological interrogation. Of course, these experiments were deeply unethical and inhumane. It had a severe psychological impact on Ted and likely planted the seeds of destruction and violence that later led him to become a serial bomber. Ironically, the bomber was a product of the CIA and the US government. Ted already had his own views and beliefs about technology and society, but the violent path he chose to express those ideas was most likely influenced by the psychological trauma he endured during these experiments. These experiments, in fact, were repeated multiple times over the following 3 years. Despite his harshness during the interrogations, Professor Henry would return afterward and act like a loving friend to Ted, essentially manipulating him. Imagine a 16-year-old boy, no matter how intelligent or brilliant, being psychologically toyed with by an expert in the field. Professor Henry died in 1988, before Ted's identity as the bomber was revealed, and before his connection to Ted became known. The issue of these experiments surfaced during Ted's trial, when his legal team brought it up in his defense, arguing that he was mentally unstable and that the experiments had distorted his thinking and led to his criminal actions. Their aim was to save Ted from the death penalty, as his crimes were eligible for such punishment. So they pursued a defense strategy based on insanity to try to secure a life sentence instead. But Ted completely rejected this strategy. He refused to let his lawyers portray him as insane, because doing so would imply that his beliefs were irrational. His ideas were his message to the world, and he would never allow them to be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. In later interviews, Ted claimed that the experiments at Harvard didn't break him or change who he was. In fact, he said he willingly participated in them for 3 years without being forced. When asked why, he explained that he knew the purpose of the experiments was to destroy his mind and beliefs, and he went in order to prove that he couldn't be broken. Ted insisted that the experiments didn't affect him the way his lawyers claimed, but logically, that's exactly the kind of thing a brainwashed person would say. When Ted found out that his brother David was the one who had reported him to the FBI, he was devastated. He had believed that despite the distance between them, his brother still loved him, and he felt deeply betrayed. He told his lawyers that he no longer had a family and didn't want to see or hear from any of them again. Meanwhile, the lawyers were secretly in contact with David, who urged them to pursue the insanity defense in order to save Ted from execution. The legal team stuck to this plan, going against Ted's wishes, and even requested that the government move Ted's cabin from the forest into a storage facility. Indeed, they brought in a helicopter and airlifted the cabin, which remains in an FBI storage facility to this day. The purpose of moving it was to use it as evidence of Ted's insanity at trial. After all, what sane person chooses to live in complete isolation in a primitive cabin in the woods? It lacked even the most basic living necessities. They even planned to contrast photos of Ted as a university professor with his disheveled appearance at the time of his arrest, aiming to show that he had transformed into a madman. The lawyers did all of this behind Ted's back and even lied to his face, telling him not to worry, and that they wouldn't pursue the insanity defense. Ted was repeatedly shocked in court to find his instructions ignored, and that his legal team was painting him as insane. It got to the point that he requested to fire them and represent himself, but the judge denied the request, saying it was too late to change his legal team. Ted, in a deep state of frustration, even attempted suicide in his cell, but he was stopped at the last moment. That's how much his beliefs and philosophy meant to him. He couldn't bear to let them go. It was as if the Harvard experiments had made him cling to his ideas even more tightly. They had become his identity and only refuge. To abandon them would be to abandon himself. No matter what, he refused to be labeled as insane. Eventually, the prosecution offered Ted a deal. They would drop the death penalty in exchange for a full confession. Every detail of his crimes and all that had happened from start to finish. Ted initially refused to speak, but after all he endured with his legal team, he accepted the deal. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to ADX Florence, the only supermax prison in the US, the highest security prison in the world, housing some of the most dangerous and notorious criminals, including El Chapo. In this prison, inmates are kept in complete isolation, never seeing one another. It's permanent solitary confinement, with each prisoner monitored by surveillance cameras at all times. Ted spent most of his time in his cell writing and was allowed to send his writings outside and communicate with people. Some journalists even interviewed him while he was incarcerated. From the way he spoke, one could sense intelligence and insight. Many of his ideas were well thought out, which left people wondering, how did someone this smart become a killer? In any case, Ted remained in that prison for the rest of his life. He was diagnosed with cancer in 2021, and after battling the disease for 2 years, he died in prison in 2023. And with that, the story of the Unabomber came to an end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.